The deployment raises fundamental questions about the role of the federal government in addressing local crises. While the National Guard is commonly used for emergencies such as natural disasters or large-scale unrest, its use in routine crime control is highly controversial. Legal experts warn that blurring the lines between civilian policing and military support could threaten democratic norms and civil liberties. There is also the question of precedent. If the federal government can send troops into Chicago to deal with crime, what stops it from intervening in other cities facing similar challenges? Critics argue that this centralization of authority could dangerously expand executive power. At the same time, the deployment reflects a widespread frustration shared by many Americans. Across the nation, urban areas continue to struggle with violent crime, inequality, and economic instability. For residents living in dangerous neighborhoods, debates about constitutional authority often take a backseat to the urgent need for safety. Trump's decision appeals to those who see crime as an immediate crisis requiring bold and decisive action. For them, federal intervention is a demonstration of leadership in the face of local inaction. The symbolism of this decision is as significant as its practical impact. Trump has long positioned himself as a law and order leader, and the move reinforces that image for his political base. Sending the Guard into Chicago not only highlights his willingness to challenge Democratic leaders, but also signals his broader stance on public safety and governance. However, the same symbolism that appeals to his supporters risks alienating moderates and independents who view military-style interventions in domestic issues with suspicion. Many Americans are asking whether such measures truly address the root causes of violence or simply paper over deeper problems that will resurface once the troops leave. Whether this deployment is ultimately viewed as a success or failure will depend on outcomes in the coming weeks and months. If shootings decrease and residents report feeling safer, Trump and his allies will claim victory and argue that the move validates their approach. If, however, the presence of troops sparks protests, civil unrest, or incidents of excessive force, critics will point to the decision as reckless and counterproductive. In either case, the long-term reality is that Chicago's challenges cannot be solved through temporary security measures alone. The city's future safety will depend on addressing underlying issues such as economic inequality, racial disparities, access to education, and systemic neglect. Trump's decision to send 300 National Guard troops to Chicago is a powerful moment in the ongoing debate over crime, governance, and democracy in America. It highlights the tension between federal authority and local control, between immediate security and long-term reform, and between political theater and practical solutions. For supporters, it represents strength and decisive action in the face of violence. For opponents, it raises alarms about overreach, militarization, and the erosion of local autonomy. What is clear is that this move will continue to spark intense debate not just in Chicago, but across the entire nation, as Americans struggle to find the right balance between safety, freedom, and justice in deeply divided times. The deployment of 300 National Guard troops to Chicago is not simply a local story about one city's struggle with crime. It is a national story about identity, governance, and the competing visions of America's future. In many ways, Chicago becomes a stage upon which larger battles are fought, not only between Democrats and Republicans, but between two deeply different philosophies of how society should be governed and protected. One philosophy insists that strong enforcement, clear authority, and uncompromising law and order measures are the only way to restore peace. The other emphasizes prevention, investment in communities, and addressing inequality at its roots as the only path to sustainable safety. And the tension between these philosophies is not new, but Trump's decision has brought it back to the center of public debate. For Trump's supporters, the decision carries a certain symbolism that goes beyond Chicago. To them, it represents the idea that government can and should act boldly when ordinary citizens are in danger. They see a leader unafraid to use power to protect lives, a leader who is not paralyzed by bureaucracy or constrained by political correctness. This image is powerful, especially in a political climate where many voters feel disillusioned by empty promises and endless debates that rarely produce results. the deployment becomes a statement. America's government will not stand by while violence consumes its cities. But for critics, the move embodies something entirely different. It represents a dangerous step toward authoritarianism, a blurring of military and civilian authority, and a disregard for the democratic principle that local communities should govern themselves. To them, sending troops into Chicago does not solve the crisis. It signals a federal intrusion into the lives of ordinary citizens, one that risks escalating fear rather than easing it. They worry that it creates a precedent where political leaders can use the military to achieve symbolic victories, rather than investing in real solutions. The consequences of such a precedent are deeply troubling as it raises the question, where does it stop? Inside Chicago, the human stories behind this decision are complex. In neighborhoods where parents worry daily about their children walking to school, where gunfire is a constant backdrop, the arrival of additional security can bring a sense of relief. For families that have lost loved ones to violence, the urgency of safety outweighs almost everything else. These residents are less concerned about political symbolism and more focused on whether the presence of troops will make their neighborhood safer tonight, this week, or this month. Yet in other neighborhoods, particularly those with long histories of tense relations with police, the sight of National Guard uniforms may bring back painful memories. Chicago has experienced waves of protest, clashes between communities and authorities, and cycles of mistrust that span generations. For these residents, the Guard's presence feels less like protection and more like occupation. They ask whether militarizing their streets addresses the conditions that produce crime in the first place. Conditions like lack of jobs, underfunded schools, and neglected infrastructure. They fear that when the troops leave, the same problems will remain untouched and unhealed. The economic dimension of the issue is impossible to ignore. Chicago is one of America's most vibrant and culturally rich cities, but it is also a city of stark inequality. Gleaming skyscrapers and thriving businesses stand not far from neighborhoods where unemployment and poverty are deeply entrenched. This divide feeds resentment and fuels the conditions for violence. Critics argue that deploying troops is like applying a bandage to a wound that requires surgery. Unless investments are made in jobs, education, and community programs, the cycle of crime will continue. To them, the focus on policing is a distraction from the harder, more expensive, but ultimately more effective work of building opportunity. Trump's decision also plays into the politics of perception. Crime in Chicago, though serious, is often highlighted disproportionately in national media because it fits into a larger narrative about Democratic-led cities being unable to govern effectively. This framing benefits Republicans politically as it allows them to position themselves as the party of safety and order. By authorizing the Guard deployment, Trump is not only addressing a real problem, but also reinforcing a narrative that aligns with his political identity. In this sense, the move is as much about optics as it is about policy. The legal and constitutional questions surrounding the deployment add yet another layer of complexity. The National Guard typically operates under the authority of state governors, but Trump's authorization raises concerns about the balance of power between state and federal governments. Illinois leaders, particularly Governor Pritzker and Mayor Johnson, have voiced opposition to the move, arguing that decisions about law enforcement should remain local. When federal power overrides state and city authority, it raises the issue of whether this undermines the principle of federalism that lies at the heart of American democracy. Critics argue that such actions could slowly erode the independence of local governments, concentrating power in the hands of the presidency. On the global stage, decisions like this also shape how America is perceived. The image of U.S. troops patrolling city streets can be unsettling, not only for citizens at home, but for observers abroad. It challenges the notion of America as a beacon of democracy, where civilian governance is firmly separated from military authority. In countries where authoritarianism is common, the use of troops in domestic matters often signals weakness or instability. For America, which prides itself on projecting strength and democracy internationally, this image can send mixed messages. Looking at the future, the question becomes whether such deployments will become normalized. If crime in cities continues to rise, will federal leaders, Republican or Democrat, feel pressure to use the Guard as a quick, visible solution. If protests erupt, will troops be used to maintain order? And if that becomes the norm, what does it mean for civil liberties, for the right to protest, and for the delicate balance between security and freedom? These are questions that extend far beyond Chicago, touching the core of America's democratic experiment. At the same time, it is important to recognize why moves like this resonate with so many Americans. There is a profound sense of insecurity in parts of the country today, not only from crime, but also from economic uncertainty, political division, and cultural change. For people who feel that their communities are unraveling, the sight of troops in the streets can be interpreted not as a threat, but as reassurance that the government still cares. This emotional resonance is powerful, and it is part of why Trump's decision strikes such a chord with his base. It reflects not only a policy choice, but also an emotional appeal to those who feel unsafe and unheard. Ultimately, the deployment of 300 National Guard troops to Chicago is a moment that encapsulates the contradictions of American politics. A nation that values freedom but demands safety, that champions local control but looks to Washington for answers. That wants bold action but fears authoritarianism. The decision is a microcosm of America's ongoing struggle to reconcile its ideals with its realities. Whether the move brings temporary peace, sparks greater conflict, or simply fades into history as another political gesture, it has already succeeded in drawing the nation's attention to Chicago and to the unresolved question of how America will define safety, governance, and democracy in the years to come. The future of our cities depends on the choices we make today. Stand informed, speak up, and demand real solutions for safety, justice, and freedom.